welcome to this PRCA webinar on climate policy and explaining the new expectations for corporates around climate lobbying disclosure criteria for companies signed up to the UN's Race to Zero campaign and other voluntary initiatives. Joining me today are our expert panelists. They are Matthew Phillips, Communications Director for the High-Level Climate Champions for COP27 and COP28, Ross Gillam, Head of Media Relations at the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change and Co-Chair of Communications Working Group at Climate Action 100+, and Sarah Goodenough, Head of Policy at the Climate Policy Radar. So let's start. Each of you represent organizations who are really, I would sort of summarize you all as trying to help organizations to understand and navigate an emerging plethora of climate policy and climate regulations, and also to help them to do so in a consistent way and provide some of the frameworks that govern that. It'd be useful perhaps if we start by just summarizing some of those frameworks, what they do, why they exist, who they apply to, and maybe some guidance from you in terms of what that means for corporates and other organizations in terms of their disclosure. And perhaps Matthew, you could start to talk to us about the Race to Zero initiative that you've been responsible for.
Thank you, Chris. As many on this call will know, we kicked off the Race to Zero in 2020 because there was a proliferation of Race to Zero commitments, and we wanted to bring together a framework featuring a lot of partners that we work very closely with to understand what excellence looked like in the field of net zero, bearing in mind there was a lot of cynicism around net zero commitments at that juncture. So we introduced a four-part criteria, first of which is pledge to net zero emissions with a kind of checkpoint 2030 target to halve emissions by 2030 in line with the Paris Agreement. Number two, to basically put a plan in place, a credible one, on how you're going to meet that target. Number three, to demonstrate that you're basically delivering action right now. This isn't just a faraway target into the future, but you're on the journey, so to speak. And fourthly, that you transparently report back on the progress of how you're kind of meeting the plan, the target, etc. We decided last year that all of those criteria weren't enough, and then actually what we needed to do was to introduce a fifth part of the criteria, which we call the fifth P, around persuade and policy. And we introduced this because we know we need the level of commitment around net zero. Secondly, we know we need immediate delivery, and there's a huge implementation gap at the moment that has become all the more glaring because of the IIGCC report that came out on Monday. But thirdly, we also need to close the advocacy gap, as I'm going to describe it, and Sarah will have a lot to say on that in a moment. So we introduced this kind of fifth part of the criteria on June the 15th last year. We probably break it down into four different areas. One is all corporates need to align their advocacy practices with that target to go to net zero by 2050 and to halve emissions by 2030. This means strictly doing no harm, just making sure that there is that alignment. So this includes lobbying practices, it includes public relations, it includes any campaigns and events and membership of associations. The second part of this persuade criteria is around proactive engagement. So going beyond the simple alignment and working out what actually can we do to lobby for the positive Paris-aligned policies that we need. So this includes what I describe at a subnational level. So that's like regulations within the city space, within the kind of the regional space and the sector space, but also at a national level. So what kind of do we need to see from our governments in terms of nationally determined contributions, in terms of long-term strategies? Thirdly, we need to make sure that the governance is in place within these companies. What we've found is that companies are multi-headed beasts. They're not homogenous organizations. So how can we really understand the internal education of where those relationships lie and how they can get in alignment with the net zero that we're looking for. And then the fourth part, which I've already mentioned, but is really important for persuading policy, which is disclose where those affiliations are, and then work out basically how you can kind of develop relationships with those associations in order maybe to drive those associations in terms of what they're doing around net zero to come in line with Paris. So those are the kind of 4 parts, and I'll pause there for now, Chris.
Thanks, Matthew. And I think that's fascinating. It shows the breadth of the requirements, but also how well joined up they are, and how actually it's sort of forcing companies, as you say, to start to think in a much more joined up way, and to, particularly when they are global, to start to assess those risks and to understand their impact at a global scale and in all the markets in which they operate. Ross, I'm going to ask you now. You obviously part of the IIGCC, but also lead the communications and for the Climate Action 100+ group. And in some respects, you were the pioneers for the investor community, I suppose, around the disclosure. And many of the frameworks that we're talking about today are all sort of pulling in the same or similar directions. Perhaps you could tell us about Climate Action 100+, how the framework works, and how it relates to some of the other frameworks that we're discussing today.
Absolutely. Well, first off the bat, it's great to hear some of the stuff that Matthew was talking about there, because there's definitely crossover with the benchmark, which I'll cover off in a moment. So just to take a step back very briefly for those that aren't aware of Climate Action 100+, the broad premise is that there's a list of what we call the focus companies, and there are 166 of the highest carbon emitting publicly listed companies globally. Then having identified those companies, we've then created what we call the net zero company benchmark. And then on an annual basis, the benchmark, which is underpinned by 10 different indicators that capture climate related disclosures from everything from short, medium, long-term greenhouse gas targets to capital alignment, so CapEx strategies. They are captured on an annual basis and given a scorecard based on traffic light system of whether we meet criteria, partially meet criteria, or don't meet criteria at all. So those 166 companies that I mentioned every year will have scorings based on their disclosures, based on those 10 different climate related metrics. Now, one of those metrics is climate policy engagement. So that covers both policies and their disclosures with regards to direct and indirect lobbying. So some of, again, what Matthew was covering around industry associations and so forth, it captures the disclosures around those. Now, in terms of the value and how the benchmark is actually then used, is basically the information that it provides is then meant to provide a kind of a base level for investors to then be able to make judgment calls and inform their decision making with regards to corporate engagement that they might then want to take. Now, critically and very importantly, just to make clear that the initiative itself, so Climate Action 100+, has no mandates over investors whatsoever. So it is only meant to be for information purposes. The actual decisions that investors then take, whether that is through their voting at ATMs, through to any of the corporate engagement they undertake, and indeed investment decisions, are taken by them independently for their own purposes. But there's also an alignment assessment, which is on the other side of the benchmark, which I didn't mention up top, that complements the disclosures as well. And that too also has a climate policy engagement part to it, which is conducted by the third party influence map, which some of you may have come across, which is incredibly helpful actually and provides a good level of detail on it. So that hopefully just gives you a snapshot as to what the benchmark is, how it's used, and indeed an introduction to the climate policy elements as well.
Thanks, Ross. And it is a really useful framework. I have to say, I've used it myself a few times with clients doing the reporting, and it's very clear. And I know there are some changes as well that have happened recently that we'll cover shortly. But if I could pass to you now, Sarah, I know Climate Policy Radar, relatively new organisation, but you're sort of there to help to help companies to find and summarize the climate policy particularly relevant to their organization. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit because I know that you don't represent the UN high-level expert group on non-state actors, but there was an important report that was published at COP27, and I wonder if you could summarize parts of that are particularly relevant to this discussion, and also touch on the global standard that exists, which is related and similar to some of the frameworks that we've already discussed.
Of course, and thank you, Chris. I mean, the beautiful thing of all of this is recognizing the convergence that's already happening very clearly in the kind of political direction of travel at both the national and an international level. And to some extent, my intervention is almost a little bit boring because it's quite repetitive and building very much on what Matthew and Ross have already said. And I think specifically looking at the global standard on responsible corporate lobbying, which came out in March of last year, IIGCC and their work is a major kind of foundational piece of this. Same with influence map. It's a beautiful thing in the climate space where the same names and the same coalitions are cropping up again and again. I mean, the global standard is a really detailed piece of the puzzle here, right? It's got like 14 different elements which companies are supposed to cover with really specific application of different requirements across regions and sectors around, much more detailed than just making a headline commitment, similar to the reason why Race to Zero exists, where companies could just say, we're going to go net zero by 2050. And everyone goes, okay, but what's underneath that? The 14-point standard really has those elements that say, like, you need responsibility at the board level, the senior management level, you need monitoring and reviewing processes, you have a process for engaging stakeholders, you need a framework for addressing misalignments. It's very detailed with specific disclosures around how much you pay your associations and how much you pay different committees that you belong to. Now, at around the same time last year, the high-level expert group was founded by the UN Secretary General, specifically to address some of these issues that we've all been aware of over the last couple of years, which is that greenwash is so frustratingly prevalent despite everyone's best efforts. And the UN Secretary General was very keen, especially to make sure that non-state actor commitments, and that's beyond businesses, investors, we're talking cities, regions, universities, you name it, but anyone who's not a government trying to do anything on climate change, really trying to tighten up the credibility screws there as well. And so they were founded in March last year as well, and they launched their high-level expert group recommendations, kind of integrity matters report at Sharm el-Sheikh. And yet again, you see fantastic alignment and consensus in the direction of travel. They're a little bit more directive in terms of the expectations of what businesses must and must not do, whereas Race to Zero is a little bit more flexible, and we can get into that later in the conversation around kind of antitrust kind of legislation and difficulties there. But essentially, the message is incredibly clear across all these different initiatives and coalitions. Stop lobbying against climate change and start lobbying for it.
Thank you all. And that's a really good summary of the major initiatives that exist and how they are all sort of converging in similar territory to help corporates and organizations to understand what good looks like. But I would, an observation I would make, and perhaps some of our audience would make as well, is that none of these are yet mandatory. There's not a particular requirement forcing companies to make these disclosures. And so I would just ask you all, and I have my own view on this, but what are some of the benefits? Why might a company, might you recommend that a company makes these sorts of disclosures above and beyond everything that you've already mentioned? And Matthew, do you want to start us off?
Well, I would say, Chris, quite simply because companies want to be on the side of the angels, and who doesn't want to be in the good side of the fight, particularly with history and posterity judging all of us. But I think just to be maybe go a little bit deeper into the question, I think to kind of follow from what Sarah said, the Secretary General's recommendations have now come out. They are directive. They are basically going to be a signal to regulators at the national and at the subnational level of the types of regulations they need to put in place. If corporations want to get out in front of that regulatory landscape that is now being set by those recommendations, they need to proactively engage in policy. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say is, like, this is the accountability year as it concerns the UN climate process. Simon Steele has said that he wants this global stocktake year to be about acceleration and accountability and ambition. And I think he's putting a major emphasis on this. So again, like, this is a way for corporates to kind of boldly step out into the open because they've been bashed in terms of greenwashing. And actually, this is a moment where they can sort of take back control and say, no, these are the regulations, the policies, the standards that we're crying out for. So I think that's extraordinarily empowering in a way that perhaps they've not felt in the last 1 or 2 years. And then I think, maybe this is for Ross to kind of go deeper on, but investors are also calling for it. So the money is already channeling that corporations need to follow suit. So there's just a kind of few elements that I think are worth bearing in mind, but hopefully it's mainly because everyone wants to be in the good fight.
Thank you. Yeah, and Ross, you obviously have the investor perspective, and that certainly feels like it's supercharged efforts in the last few years. Yeah, what's your perspective on that same question?
I'd agree with everything that Matthew says there. I think you kind of have to take a step back and understand that as a point of principle, obstructive climate policy engagement is one of the biggest barriers to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? So overcoming that is critical. Now, to put that into a bit more kind of into specifics and what that might mean for companies, I think there's huge reputational challenges associated with it. If on one hand you've got organizations taking certain public positions and communicating X, Y, and Z, however, on the other hand, their lobbying activity, either directly or indirectly, is found to be contradictory to that, that poses huge reputational challenges. There was a instance of an organization in the financial services industry not too long ago that are actually quite strong advocates when it comes to climate. Now, they were found by some good journalism, I think we can say, to be sponsors of a organization in the US that was actively lobbying against climate progress. Whether that was done knowingly or not, there was clearly an inherent contradiction between those two positions, and as a consequence, faced some reputational challenges. But more than that, actually, I think they faced more questions from their clients. So it wasn't just the negative headlines. I think they had to deal operationally with some challenges too. And so I think part of the reason for why companies might want to disclose on this side is A, for the reputational challenges that I've mentioned, but I also wouldn't be surprised, and I have no inside knowledge on this at all, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are other organizations, companies out there that maybe actually do have these associations or lobbying activities that are contradictory to perhaps their stated positions, whether knowingly or not. And so I think going through the process of actually developing a policy, looking at it themselves internally to make sure that it is all aligned to where it should be, operationally, I'd have thought it would be a good exercise for them to undertake as well. So there's kind of an internal side to it, but also the external reputational side too. So a couple of more kind of pragmatic points, perhaps.
Yeah, and I have to say, having done a few of these assessments with clients, actually, simply the benefits of better understanding what the organization is doing in a global context and making sure that there is that strong alignment between what the one hand is doing and the other hand is doing is extremely useful, and actually really helps to de-risk those relationships in a way that I don't think has happened before. And I would also say I tend to view climate as the wedge issue. Right now we're looking at and talking about alignment between and disclosure around climate policy and what you ask others to do, and indirectly. But there will be other issues. We obviously have the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures forming their framework at the moment around expectations for corporates to disclose their impact on nature and biodiversity. And so I can see a situation where actually these frameworks may well develop in the future into other aspects of policy and require disclosure around other aspects of policy. So to your point, Matthew, sort of getting out ahead and putting in place those structures and frameworks that can help to provide that clarity on climate policy is only going to serve you to be better placed to respond when the expectations are changed again and requirements around disclosure for other impacts become requirements or expectations from different stakeholders. Sarah, I know that you're not necessarily related to any of the particular frameworks, but you've obviously experienced organizations who are disclosing in this way. What other benefits do you see, or not necessarily benefits, reasons why organizations should be participating in this sort of disclosure?
I mean, you've already alluded to one of the major trends here, right? Like disclosure is going to be, and already is one of the biggest growing issues for corporates and for investors. You know, we're talking specifically in the context of climate lobbying, but it's going to extend more broadly, as you say, to nature-based issues and other elements. I would say that Matthew's really hit the nail on the head here in terms of what we would describe it as a transition risk, where sure, we're discussing climate lobbying disclosure as a voluntary framework now, but the timeline between these sorts of frameworks being introduced as voluntary standards by maybe one or two kind of consortia, then becoming into kind of mandatory frameworks and introduced in regulation, like that's going to start getting faster and faster. You know, the more emissions rise, the slower we're getting to act on climate change, the faster that voluntary to regulation pipeline is going to move. And I always think, you know, almost fondly, as no one really does, about the launch of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure in 2015, where the handful of companies who signed up to it were almost kind of laughed at is, why are you bothering to align with this voluntary initiative? You fast forward 8 years and it's mandatory in, you know, a good number of countries, and you know, and is on the table to be enforced in many others. And climate lobbying disclosure is just yet another example of something which, you know, I feel quite sorry for the companies who are looking at it now and laughing and going, oh, I can't be bothered, that's too much effort, you know, that's only a couple of activists, or, you know, my specific investor isn't asking for it, so why should I bother? And it's going to be less than 8 years before suddenly they're turning around and realizing that it's mandatory, and that all the jurisdictions that they're operating in are requiring very detailed disclosure on climate lobbying. And so it's not just because you want to be on the side of the angels, not just in actually what you're lobbying for, but specifically that you're disclosing it, but that it's going to cost you time and money to learn how to do this really quickly. So you might as well get ahead of it and learn as it's evolving. And with lobbying itself, you know, you want to be in the decision-making room when it's all happening, because all of this stuff is coming down the line, whether we like it or not. So you might as well try and influence it, shape it, learn how to do it from the outset, because it makes that ramp so much smoother.
Thank you. I want to turn now just to some of the changes that are happening, particularly in some of the frameworks that we've been discussing. Matthew, I know obviously Race to Zero put in place what you described as sort of starting line requirements, and then additional requirements around members, and you sort of set the clock going in terms of when you expect those requirements to be met by your members. But it'd be useful to get a bit of an update from you in terms of how that's going, and whether there are any changes at all in that. And Ross, just to tee you up as well, I know the Climate Action 100+ and Influence Map have looked at your framework and recently undertook a consultation around that framework and changes to that framework. It'd be useful to sort of, if you could highlight some of the key points that you've decided to change as part of that consultation.
Thanks, Chris. Perhaps I'll just kick us off with what Race to Zero and partners are doing. So as mentioned, we introduced the persuade policy element of our criteria back on June 15th last year. So the clock started at that moment, and we said to our members and partners, you have 12 months to show how you are applying this 5th P within your frameworks. So essentially what we're looking for is for partners to show how within their kind of frameworks to members, and members is obviously the individual companies and investors that we're talking about, to show how they're already kind of cascading that downwards. And we currently have a review process that is ongoing with our expert peer review group. And basically what we will do is we will define between now and June 15 what kind of consideration period we'll have for those partners that are found not to be obviously flowing that 5th P into their frameworks. The second thing to say is that members themselves, i.e. individual companies, will have an extra year to show to the partner coalitions, such as Under 2 and C40, etc. So cities, businesses and regions, how they are already kind of pursuing the sort of the 5th P and applying that. So it breaks down in 2 levels. So we've got 1 year for the partners and the coalitions to show how it's incorporated within their frameworks, and then another year for individual entities to show what they're doing in terms of alignment and proactive engagement. So that's June 2024. But I should say we really encourage all of our members and partners to get on board with this right now, as Sarah says, to get out in front of it. And actually, we'd be hoping to have a real spike moment around COP28 to say, hey, non-state actors are already doing this. They want to get out in front of this. They are racing ahead of the game, ahead of regulators. That's really what we want to do. The other thing, Chris, that's worth mentioning is, I mentioned at the top that there was a proliferation of net zero commitments. My goodness, I think even ExxonMobil came out with a net zero commitment last year. So that just gives you a sense of how all of us, through our various kind of efforts, have tried to bring a degree of excellence and rigor to what we're doing. The same could be said in terms of proliferation with toolkits for policy and advocacy, etc. There is so much amazing work going on. Series have done things, BSR are doing things, the Cambridge Leadership Group are doing things, obviously Climate Action 100+, etc. So I think, again, we need to work out how can we bring convergence to what is already becoming an acronym soup. How can we kind of have a framework that is almost a one-stop shop for doing that? So I know that there is a responsible policy engagement task force that has been set up by We Mean Business, by Influence Map, by Race to Zero and SBTI, which is hoping to actually really kick off with this overarching umbrella framework in and around mid-June, i.e., when our sort of criteria does its next round, which will hopefully provide some level of convergence to all of these different initiatives and toolkits that are currently available.
Thanks, Matthew. It's a great flag, actually, and I think one to really, for people to watch out and to be aware of that's coming down the track. And for everyone as well, we've talked a lot about a lot of different organisations, and Matthew's mentioned some of them there, who provide useful guidance and resources. And what we will be doing on the PRCA Climate Communications website is, and I'll post a link into the chat, is to post a blog about this event and to include in there a number of different resources and links to them that people can access and use in order to get their head around some of these different frameworks and the guidance that's available. Ross, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but over to you in terms of some of the changes that you've seen with the Climate Action 100+ framework through that consultation that you had, and then I'll go to the question that we've had in our chat.
No problem. And just noting Matthew's point about the alphabet soup, I think there's a whole nother session, or probably series, should I say, to try and understand all of those and bring them together, but definitely support the sentiment about greater alignment. So with Climate Action 100+, what have we done with the benchmark, or what are we doing with the benchmark? As we move to phase 2 of the initiative, we've sought to make the benchmark more ambitious, but also more practical in supporting investors' engagement with corporates. So with that in mind, we undertook a consultation, a public consultation last year, amongst which many of the investors as part of the initiative took part in, but there's also input from other third-party organisations, NGOs, and it was publicly available. Now, fast forwarding to where we are today, we're actually going to be announcing the revised benchmark this side of Easter, probably next week, actually. And as part of that, we have specifically looked, having identified the importance yet again of climate policy engagement, we have sought to further develop and tweak and enhance that indicator that I talked about before, part of which, and I'm pleased to say, is bringing it in greater alignment with the global standard on responsible climate lobbying. So going back to the point that we've talked about in terms of streamlining. So that has been added there. Also, just in terms of some of the language to make it easier to follow and to make sure that companies know what's being asked of them. Overall, and then looking on the assessment side of things, it is a more comprehensive benchmark when it comes to climate lobbying. So there are additional points that are being scored and kind of marked upon, as it were. So overall, it should give investors, and indeed anyone using and looking at a benchmark, a more comprehensive and full picture of how companies are disclosing or not, as the case may be, with regards to climate policy engagement. So it was really identified as one of the key points that needed to be enhanced for this next iteration of the benchmark. And I would encourage all of you to look on the website probably this time next week, or maybe back end of next week, to see the specifics as to how that has been updated.
Thanks, Ross. And yeah, looking forward to that. I saw the consultation document. Yeah, and interesting changes there. I hope yeah, to see a lot of those in the final version next week. So yeah, we'll certainly keep our eyes peeled for that. I'm going to turn to a question now in the Q&A that we've been asked, and I might just start answering that myself if that's okay, because I've done a few of these assessments. So the question asks, how should companies evaluate the different frameworks to determine what disclosures and in what format they should be making them? I think one of the words that I would use is convergence, because actually what we have seen is convergence across a lot of the different frameworks. I would also say it's important to start with to decide which of those frameworks is most applicable to you and your organization, because if you are among that group of companies that Ross mentioned, that the Climate Action 100+ group of investors is focused on, then actually that framework is perhaps most pertinent to you, because that is and will involve your investors, who will be using the proxy voting season and opportunities to ask your leadership and your boards about what you are doing in terms of your climate policy and lobbying disclosure. So, but if you are a city or another organization who's obviously not a listed company and doesn't have that investor mandate, then you may well be part of the Race to Zero campaign via some of the other accredited bodies, and therefore in some respects it's the Race to Zero framework which applies most specifically to your organization. So I would say it sort of depends on what type of organization you are and which of the frameworks is most applicable to you. And then in terms of formats, I've mostly been involved in working with listed organizations to produce reports, and those reports have obviously been publicly produced and published on their websites as part of their reporting and disclosure documents. Some have been done and most have actually been done as separate reports that have sought to make clear and often just bring together the different parts of climate policy and lobbying that have happened on behalf of the organization. But then also the Climate Action 100+ framework is very clear in terms of how you then report upon the alignment or misalignment between the policies of your organization, the alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement, and the third-party organizations that you are that you have included in a review. So the format, it just tends to be a typical reporting format, but there is a requirement in terms of the regularity of that. The recommendation is clear that actually a report should be produced every year and provide an update, particularly in terms of engagement with groups where there is misalignment between the stated climate policy and the policies of that third party. So format in terms of timing tends to be an annual report. So I hope that sort of covered that question. Anything to add from any of you? No. Okay. I'm going to turn to the second question now, and perhaps Sarah, you could start us off with this, because I think it speaks very much to what Climate Policy Radar is about. But what appetite do the question asks, what appetite do regulators seem to have for requiring policy lobbying disclosures, and what timeline do the panelists expect for the transition away from voluntary?
So this is actually a really interesting issue, and I'd love to hear Ross and Matthew's thoughts on it. But one of the largest issues that's already coming to light with regards to kind of organized efforts and kind of consortia setting these kind of convergence rules and lobbying, as we've just been discussing, is immediately coming against different barriers and challenges with regards to antitrust legislation and anti-competition law. And so the route to regulation in terms of lobbying and lobbying disclosure is a little bit of a challenge here, because we're coming up against outdated systems, which, in order to prevent kind of cartel-like and anti-competitive behavior, are actually hindering positive climate and coordinated action. And so you saw a lot of this, and I know Ross knows about this as well, for the Climate Action 100+ in the States recently, with different Republican states really pushing back against this. And there was a furore around the Securities and Exchange Commission publishing kind of draft guidance where they were going to require even more concrete disclosure around climate lobbying in 2022, and I think they've now moved that to voluntary rather than mandatory. And so, you know, I almost wish that I could answer and say the timeline's 2 to 3 years, you know, so that will help you with your corporate planning. Unfortunately, that's not the case. What I think is useful to understand is that, at least for those who are fighting, as Matthew has said, like the good fight with regards to, you know, the more activist and NGO and coordinated efforts who are trying to push this through, there are these really interesting barriers that we're now coming up against in terms of institutions and legislation not being fit for purpose. But that is not going to remain the case. You know, there are going to be ways in which, you know, organizations and coalitions work with governments and work with other institutions to find ways in which we can still push through organized and proactive and positive effort on kind of climate lobbying, and the disclosure requirements will at least remain very, very important and emphasized in a voluntary capacity until they can become mandatory as well. I don't know, Matthew, if you wanted to come in on that as well.
Yeah, we're at an interesting turning point, I'd say, where we're basically seeing the last gasps of this outmoded regulatory system trying to kind of resist the inevitable of this new climate regime that I believe is currently already taking effect, and we're just witnessing that tension. I would say the shift is happening, and we're already seeing it specifically happening within certain jurisdictions, like in the US with the SEC requiring climate disclosure. Those rules, I believe, start to take effect even this year. Corporations are railing against it or are showing leadership. So this is very much happening. I've also mentioned this is the accountability year, so I expect nations to really step up in Dubai and start talking about how they're really going to be taking this seriously. And the other thing to add, building off what Sarah said at the beginning around the high-level expert group recommendations, is it has the provision within it under recommendation 10 that a task force should be set up on regulation featuring national regulators. Now, I don't know what that looks like, but when that comes into effect, then again, this is going to accelerate this whole process. But in terms of the barriers that Sarah pointed to, yes, they're happening. The fight is real. Do you want to be in a good fight? Do you want to be in a bad fight? With Race to Zero specifically, we had to drop our kind of explicit language around no new coal because it was deemed to be in breach of competition laws, because we were effectively removing an entire sector. Now, if you read the criteria closely, it says all your targets need to be science aligned with the IEA and the IPCC, which actually implicitly means no new coal. But regardless, we had to take out that language. Interesting. And obviously there's a huge debate we could have right now around where did the pressure come for us to kind of remove that. I would say what's interesting now is that the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority in the UK, has already relaxed its competition laws to allow actually climate positive coalitions to still come forward on this. So actually there's a huge room that as these barriers are happening, corporations step into that room and again lobby and positively call for the types of laws and regulations that we need to see even at that level. So the tension's playing out, the fight is now, but lots of interesting things that we can move and also lessons that we can learn from.
I'll ask our audience again if there are any other questions you want to ask, but I will ask a couple more if that's okay. I wonder if you have any examples of companies or organizations that you feel are doing this well in terms of their disclosure and their how they've embraced this this requirement and really shown leadership. Maybe Matthew could start us off on that.
Yeah, happy to. And I can't remember if we mentioned this earlier on the call when we were talking about the benefits of proactive engagement, but I don't know if we did, because this seems like the obvious one. Perhaps Ross did, because you were very comprehensive, but this is good for the bottom line for companies. So an example I often use is Signify, formerly Phillips lighting, that have been calling for LED lighting, knowing that they already capture a lot of the LED market. So as soon as those regulations from subnationals or national regulators come in place, they're like quids in. It's going to kind of positively benefit them as an organization in terms of their bottom line. So there is a very kind of good, sound economic foundation for doing this. The second thing that I've noticed is, and I've mentioned We Mean Business already, but they do tremendous work in terms of bringing companies together around pushing national governments in the right direction. So we saw not so long ago, actually, 408 businesses who have a US footprint who lobbied the Biden administration to include a strong 2030 target within the national commitment that was in line with the Paris Agreement. And that obviously happened. And it's an amazing thing that corporations can get involved in, because it's not about the power of the one, it's about the power of the many. And so I think there are kind of two games that can be played here. One is that kind of independent policy exercise. Two is that sort of sector-wide exercise, and actually a third one, which is around kind of mass broad engagement, and that's truly transformational.
Ross, how about you in terms of the interactions you've seen with organisations? What do you think is a good standard of disclosure and engagement?
I would disclose, and you may be able to hear it, there's a fire alarm going off in the background. So if it's hugely distracting to those, then I will go back on mute, but I'll carry on as far as I can, and hopefully get out of the building alive.
I hope it's a test.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not sure. I'll just keep going. What I would say is that the latest round of benchmark assessments found that only 11% of all of those 166 companies are meeting all of the criteria. So that leaves a huge gulf in terms of where there needs to be improvement and greater disclosures ultimately. I would also highlight one company, not necessarily as being the kind of best in class in terms of overall, but where there has been some recent updates, and that's Mercedes. Now, there was quite a concerted effort, I think, from a number of investors last year, looking specifically at the automotive sector and their lobbying activities. I think for kind of obvious reasons: one, the importance of the sector to the transition overall, and B, the ongoing policy legislation that we see going through various parliaments at the moment. So really critical point for that industry in terms of their lobbying activities. As a consequence of some of that engagement from investors, we saw Mercedes, amongst others as well, provide those disclosures that investors were looking for. On the flip side, however, VW, and I think this was quite publicly highlighted at the time, didn't provide those disclosures that investors were looking for, to the extent that, and it was quite an unprecedented step, that a group of investors, including the Church of England Pension Board, as well as some Scandinavian pension funds, took it upon themselves to file a legal case against VW. The specifics of the legal case was actually around trying to get an item put onto the AGM agenda rather than the climate piece specifically, but it is nonetheless relating to that. So going back to Matthew's point about engagement as well, and the benchmark through Climate Action 100+ more broadly, it shows how where companies aren't meeting the requirements or seemingly meeting requirements of investors, they are taking action to kind of ramp up that pressure to try and push things through. Where that necessarily nets out, we'll have to wait and see. But I think it's an example of action being taken nonetheless.
Thank you, Ross. That was a great answer in the midst of a fire alarm. If you need to exit the building, then please do that. I don't want you to risking your safety to join the rest of our call.
Don't worry, there's a window next to me, actually. I'm sure I'm only on the first floor, so I can jump out if I need to, I guess.
Okay, I will leave that to your better judgment. But I think one of the things I would just add to what's been said so far is that all of these groups, in terms of what their expectations are for corporates, yes, they set out a framework, but their expectation is not necessarily for perfection. And one of the things that I've certainly counseled clients is that the word that we have to really use as we go into this form of disclosure is transparency. There's an expectation, even if you discover a misalignment between your policies and Paris policies, or if you discover a misalignment between your policies and those of a trade association that is that you're a member of and that is lobbying on your behalf, there's not an expectation that you necessarily exit that relationship and wash your hands and walk away. The expectation is simply to disclose that misalignment and to say how you are engaging as an organization in order to seek alignment. It's not that there's not an expectation of perfection or any sort of absolute requirements. And so I think there's often, I think, a fear among organizations as they start to go on this journey that this might sort of unearth something that they feel uncomfortable about. And I would say it may well, but the point is actually, once you do, you've got a much better understanding of that misalignment, the potential for, because you've disclosed it, the potential for that upsetting your reputation, that the risk that Ross talked about earlier is mitigated and reduced, and you've got a clear opportunity to then engage and to seek better alignment moving forward. So I have to say, I when I speak with clients about it, I don't necessarily see the much by way of a downside in terms of embracing this process and starting to disclose. We have a question from our audience, so I will turn to that. Does the panel see much engagement on this topic directly with trade bodies? I'm happy to start, but Ross, why don't we start with you on that, and I'm happy to jump in.
I must be completely honest and say that I don't really know. I probably should, but I don't. I think because the activity of Climate Action 100+ is focused largely from investors towards the companies themselves, then how that plays out with regards to trade associations, I would actually only be guessing. So I'll probably defer back to someone else, if I'm honest.
I think what I would say, just obviously, Influence Map is an organization that's closely related to Climate Action 100+, and they do produce a report on an annual basis, which actually highlights some trade associations and bodies who are whose policies are potentially problematic, and they do score trade associations for their climate policy engagement. So there is that, and I do think trade bodies will have that sort of direct engagement with these frameworks, but I also think there is the indirect engagement, and what the frameworks often require is that where there is misalignment between the policies of a trade association and the reporting organization, that organization then engages with those bodies and seeks to be more active in the forums that are part of that trade body in order to seek alignment. One of the things I would say that we often see is trade bodies who don't have clear policy, and that's not necessarily because it's not. I would say it's partly because they don't consider that an active part of their policy engagement process, and I think it is important for trade bodies where that is the case to at least publicly state that is their position, because I think more and more organizations are going to seek clarity, even if they're not necessarily expecting that trade body to actively lobby on climate policy. There is going to be an expectation that they are at least public about and publicly stating their intention to support climate policies related to the Paris Climate Agreement, because that then helps to provide demonstrable evidence of alignment for these reports. And I think that indirect engagement with corporates is something that I think trade bodies are going to see increasingly in different markets. I do think one thing that is challenging for corporates and should be embraced is where a trade association is tied to a particular geography and based in a particular market, where the government of that market, that country, does not have clear policies that align with the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think where that is the case, again, the important word is transparency, and to be clear about that misalignment, why it exists, and the extent to which, as an organization, you feel that you have the ability to impact upon the policy of that trade association, particularly if that trade association is so closely tied to the government of a particular market, and that does exist in certain markets and in certain certain sectors of the economy. So yeah, that can happen, and I think again, not a good reason to not engage in this process. Just requires transparency and openness on the part of the corporate. Matthew, Sarah, anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, happy just to give a couple of examples, Chris, which is, I mean, I wouldn't want to cast any aspersions naturally, but I'm not sure the US Chamber of Commerce covers itself exactly in glory on this subject. And I think there are conversely other trade bodies that are doing exceptional things in terms of engagement, such as I think the Confederation of British Industries, the Consumer Goods Forum, etc. I really would, to your point, Chris, encourage everyone to read that influence map report, because there's a question. I talked about the power of the many. Do we rip down these trade bodies or do we build them anew? And I think there's a real power in the latter, and that sort of that proactive engagement that you've already pointed to. So yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm conscious of time. We've only got a few minutes remaining in our time together, and I just wonder if I could ask each of you to offer your sort of final reflections and thoughts, and perhaps your hopes ahead of particularly the Conference of Parties event we'll see in Dubai later this year. What are the main things you're focused on this year in terms of climate policy, and what are your hopes for the year ahead? And maybe Sarah, could I ask you to start us off on that?
What a cruel and fantastic question. Thank you, Chris. I mean, from climate policy radar perspective, where this year is particularly exciting is, as Matthew has said, this is the year of transparency and accountability. And I think that's going to move from being a theoretical issue to a really practical concern. We're working to make essentially all climate law, policy and litigation machine readable and easily discoverable this year. And so moving from this process of a huge quantity of PDFs in a variety of foreign languages on a variety of different websites, insanely hard to discover, and then control Fing to find out what's actually understandable. That's going to be a complete game changer now, using natural language processing and large language models. And so doing that not only with all of these laws and policies, but with the global stocktake, which for those of you who don't know, is this huge process that's been kicked off this year, mandated by the Paris Agreement, you know, the first 5 years after it's now been signed, to take stock of how we're doing on climate. You know, where are we? We know from the IPCC report that dropped on Monday, we're not doing particularly well, and understanding what we can do within the next 5 to 10 years. All of those insights, again, we're reading through and we're surfacing all of these examples of best practice to understand what's going to happen. And as Matthew said, with that emphasis on accountability this year, that's where we get so much more information this year to understand where we go next. And that's going to be a real game changer. And so, yes, you know, there's a proliferation of laws, policies, and disclosure requirements. It's a very confusing, a very large and ever-changing landscape. But I think this year is going to be a year where particular points of convergence and the sharp end of the wedge on several different areas of climate action become really clear. And that will really push us through, you know, past COP28 and towards 2030 with some really clear areas of action. So it's a messy soup at the moment, but it should start to become very sharp and very exciting. So that's, hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Sarah. And I think it's an exciting moment, exciting year, and I think we all need to stay optimistic, certainly as we head into an important COP. Ross, can I turn to you to the same question?
Yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet. And I think quite simply, you asked about hope, and I think the hope is that the lobbying disclosures become the norm, and that if we were having this conversation this time next year, or maybe even sooner, it becomes just part of business as usual, better practice. So I think quite simply, it's just that that becomes the norm. And then I guess more specifically from climate action's perspective, is that we're then seeing that flowing through to improve scores on the benchmark. So I talked about the 11% that are only currently fully aligning. Hopefully we'll see that rapidly increase in the short term. So I'd say that's my hopes and aspirations for the next 6 to 12 months.
Thanks, Ross. And last but certainly not least, Matthew.
Thanks, Chris. I guess my hope is, as Sarah mentioned, it's the global stocktake year, and we all envisage that there will be some big political outcomes when governments arrive in Dubai in December. And one of those outcomes is necessarily going to be on accountability, Paris-aligned accountability. And so my big hope is that we actually build up huge momentum from corporations, but also investors, and by extension, cities and regions, that are kind of going in and creating a big landing ground for Dubai, that they are crying out and calling for the standards, policies and regulations that they want governments to kind of make when they arrive in Dubai. Because wouldn't it be great if suddenly these actors, rather than just waiting for the regulation to happen to them, put a big call to action on governments of what they expect in terms of the future we all want to create.
Absolutely, and a perfect sentiment to finish our session today. I just want to thank you all for bringing your expertise and knowledge to this panel. It's a really exciting emerging aspect of climate policy and disclosure, and I echo Ross's wishes that this becomes much more a regular event in terms of corporate agendas for the year ahead. With that, I will close the event, and for anyone who wants to see some resources on this, Laura has posted in the webinar chat the URL for the Climate Communications, PRCA Climate Communications group, and we'll host a blog on there with some links to some of the resources that you can use in order to understand and more fully explore some of the frameworks and guidance that we've discussed today. With that, I will close the event and thank you all for your participation.